Arizona's rich tapestry of African American history is as long as varied as its landscape, but it seems like this history often gets overlooked. From Mary Green, the first recorded Black resident in Phoenix back in 1868, to today's vibrant Black community of over 318,000, you think there'd be a concern or a concerted effort to celebrate and teach these stories. Yet many argue that Arizona's Black history is either sidelined or missing from the classroom. We will delve into why, despite the significant contributions and presence of Black Arizonians, their stories are frequently relegated to the background. We'll examine the reasons behind this historical neglect and question what it means for the broader narrative of Arizona's past. The stories from Arizona Republic by Kaylee Mohan, Amanda Luberto on July 9th, 2024. So I'm coming to you, Mr. Dickey.
All right.
One of the things that I know that we discussed in the background before we even got talked about is like the nuances and the layers that happens to be part of the story. Can you kind of just go over like some of your thoughts when you first came across it and read it, and what some of those layers are?
Well, I mean, first of all, I'm sure that this is a story that's common not just to Arizona, but nationwide and probably many places in the world. And so whenever I see a story like this, my first thoughts are always, okay, how am I contributing to this problem, and what can I do personally to make changes? And so one of the first things that struck me, and this was a podcast episode that we were listening to, and there was just tons of material in there, and it was a fascinating discussion between these community leaders, and I just thought it was really interesting, and so I picked out a few quotes, and so I think moving into the problem, it's important to recognize what exactly is happening here. So we can look at what's happening, and then we can look at why it's happening, and then we can look at what can we do to improvement. And so this was just a couple of quotes off the beginning of the discussion. The first one was from Jessica Salo, and she's the assistant archivist of Black collections at Arizona State University. She said 0 to 2% of known archival collections of institutional records, and she's talking about at ASU, at NAU, and at the University of Arizona. 0 to 2% of known archival collections and institutional records represent minorities, and that includes Black, Latinx, Pacific Islanders, LGBTQ+, and so on. Those groups represent 42% of the population, yet 0 to 2% of their archival collections of, various things that they, documents and literature and whatnot that they collect at the libraries there. It seems quite a bit unbalanced. 42% of the population is represented in the people, but when it comes to representing these communities in their history records, okay, so we rely on, none of us have perfect memory, and none of us have memories that can extend beyond our lifetime, and so we rely on documents and history to learn. It's important that we know about our history and not just our own personal history, but all people that are in America and in the world and so on. So the first thing that jumped out to me was that, yeah, you mentioned this was from 2024, and this kind of thing is still happening. It would be hilarious if it wasn't so tragic, and so it should be unexpected, but really, it's, we've come to expect this kind of thing, this kind of marginalization and this kind of setting people aside. But this second quote is one that really stung me when I heard it. And as a public school teacher, I teach at a state college. It really hit home. And this one was from Pastor Warren Stewart. And he said, "You may not be a white supremacist, but you're a white standardist. And so what he's saying is that of course, we're all familiar with white supremacy, and obviously that's something to be fought against and so on. But the idea of a white standardist, using the white life experience as the standard, and like I said, as a teacher, that's something that hit me hard. And again, my first thoughts were like, okay, how am I doing this, and what can I do to change it? And so it's frustrating because it's something that we've been dealing with a long time. You'd think we would be able to work this out. You think we would be able to treat different communities fairly. You think we'd be able to recognize the rich diversity in our collective history. It's frustrating and it's sad, and I'm hoping that it will continue to improve. But it's hard to be optimistic about that too.
I hear what you're saying. Eli, I'm coming to you because you remarked on how you love when we do shows together, and I have a tendency to pick stories that you have no frame of reference whatsoever.
This is not one of those.
But I'm curious to know, what are your thoughts and about the story, and also, what did this story actually inspire you to do to learn more about the history in your own area?
So I was at first guilty of the thing that I used to not realize I was guilty of, that I think probably all people do, is I looked at this through my own lens. And I was like, I don't really know anything about the history of anybody in my state. Like, there was Lewis and Clark. I'm from Missouri. There was Lewis and Clark, but they're like not from here. They just started here. Like, the majority of their thing took place outside of here. So that doesn't even count. And then it was when that statement was made about white standardism that Scott mentioned. And I thought that was such a powerful distinction to make between like that standardism and that supremacy, because people who are not eager to recognize the types of behaviors that might be harmful or not quite the most beneficial, they're less likely to take a look at those behaviors if they feel like they're being called something like a white supremacist, which most of the time isn't truly the case. They just don't realize that they are expecting everybody else to accept their lens. And I realized that if I wanted to go learn about the history of my state, I could. And most, if not all, of the characters would be people just like me, straight white men. And I don't have the problem that if I want to learn about my history, I have to go to these great unfair is the word I was looking for, but these links that other people don't have to go to in order to learn that history. And that's the important takeaway for me.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to address a little bit about that, the difference between like white supremacy and white standardism. And white supremacy more so deals with the systems that we happen to be in, because the systems in the United States favor white people, and they don't favor people who happen to come from marginalized groups. Remember, if we can go back into our history, Scott should know this, being a teacher and all, that before we even had the invention of race, what was considered a civilized person is if you were an English Christian man. So now that we have moved forward to invent race and how people fit in those particular racial nomenclatures, then that particular standard of what is considered civilized versus what is uncivilized or savage. Remember, especially like in the colonial period, the word savage was used as insane. So we basically have like a hierarchy of a system on where people would fit in and how they are treated by law. That's white supremacy. But then we have the standard that all of us basically are measured by, including what we are taught about our nation, we're taught about ourselves, and we're taught about how and what is considered important as far as like lessons learned. I can even think for myself as an anecdote that even though that I, being an African American, I went mostly to African American predominant schools, and and all of them my parents paid for. I did not know a lot of Black history until I became an adult. And it was because I took the time to seek out that history, because I felt it was important to learn this history so I can learn more about myself, because I'm part of this group and I want to know what the contributions of my group was to what we call the United States. But the standard of what was taught in schools, what was presented as lessons, were not of that ilk. Even though I had some teachers who went out of their way to teach Black history, but it was very much so on the tertiary level. It was not necessarily in a way that could be as rich and diverse as Black American history is, and especially thinking of it as not just Black history or African American history, but American history. But Jonathan, I'm coming to you before I, start doing my sermon and then, doing the collection afterwards. I will be asking for tithes and offering after the segment.
I'll do the collection. You can do the sermon. How's that?
I'm going to hold you to that. But but there were certain things that you mentioned that actually stood out to you the most when you was, being exposed to the story. Can you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, one of the things that bothered me was that the lack of representation. There's two things, actually, and I'll be brief. Yeah, that's going to happen. But there are two things. One is that the representation of minority groups isn't there in the libraries that do these archiving. There are only 3 Black librarians at ASU, and 2 are near retirement, and there's no plans to replace them with people of that community. And that leads to the main point I want to make, is that Black students have to fight, not only Black students, but brown students, rainbow students. They all have to fight for equity and inclusion, and are taught by white teachers and administrators, and the majority of people who aren't even in their community. So their community stories, their community history is ignored. How are they supposed to feel included? How are they supposed to feel part of something when they don't see themselves in those positions? Or people like them. And that has to have a great effect on their ability to learn, on their ability to grow as human beings, and their ability to participate in a society that is basically make them fight for inclusion in everything. And that's just the conditions that we're in. But we can go a long way by recruiting administrators and teachers and librarians and people who are in the community so they can represent their community at the table where the decisions are made. And we have to think about not just doing it because they're of that community, but doing it in such a way that their inclusion is natural and actually something that we expect to have happening. And I'm not in that community. I'm in one of those communities, but I'm not in the community that is most visibly affected. And that means that I may not have the right perspective here, but I do have an irritation that the representation is deliberately not there, possibly not necessarily intentionally, but considered because the culture has evolved to that position. The culture of the colonial culture has evolved to that position. And it's upsetting because I went to high school in a multicultural high school, but I wasn't aware at that time that all but one of my instructors was cis white male. There were a couple of cis white females in there. We had one Black instructor, and I had one he was half Islander. I think he was Chamorro. But anyway, all that said, that was it. And we had about a quarter of the high school population were Islanders. They were Polynesians. About a third were Black. there were probably another 15% who were Latinos or Latinas. And then there was the white guys, about 15%. It was very rich culturally, but we didn't experience that in the education. So that's the point I wanted to make.
Yeah, I hear that. And I kind of wanted to come back to that particular point about, like, despite being in settings where we are around a multifaceted people, genders and cultures and experiences, but still are not really able to learn about those things. And I kind of want to borrow a little bit, Scott, if you don't mind, from your notes, specifically from one of the panelists that was featured. I believe her name is Chanel Poe, who was an expert in education and advocacy, and who also emphasizes the systematic issues of erasure of Black history from the school curricula. And one of the things that she said, and I'm taking from you, is when I think about institutions as a former school board member, I'm looking at our beautiful, richly diverse student body that was 65% Latino, 25% African American, 6% white, and 6% Native American. As a mother of a Black son who was frustrated, angered, and felt alone when my child entered the education system, who immediately started getting suspended from school, I had to take a step back and ask ourselves, why isn't there individuals serving on this board that reflect the demographic of this district? I have another question. Why aren't there educators that reflect the demographic of this district? Because there's going to be a huge disconnect. Now, I believe that most of us are parents on this panel, and I have a question to ask all the parents. Sans Jonathan. But I'm pretty sure that you've been around kids, and you were one.
No, we're all given
Allegedly
perspectives that we don't have.
Allegedly. Right,
I mean,
allegedly.
it was over 60 years ago. Yeah.
I know. Well, I'll come to Scott and then to Eli. As a parent and especially, that cares about your kids' education, and you hear what Chanel Poe has said, what strikes you the most, and how would you say that you're able to empathize with what she was saying? Scott and then Eli.
Boy, that's quite a question there. Well, as far as my own kids' education, both my wife and I, from the get-go, we knew we wanted to prioritize exposing our kids to diverse experiences. And so when the kids were born, we lived in St. Paul City. And so they went to a city school and a public school. And when we moved out, we needed a bigger house. Or for some reason, the kids kept getting bigger. Go figure.
How dare they grow? Yeah.
So we needed a bigger house. We wanted a bigger yard. And so we moved out to the suburbs, but we deliberately kept our kids in the city schools. Which we were allowed to do as long as we provided transportation. But we did that because we wanted our children to experience those diverse life experiences, and we wanted them to see that there are other people. And I'm sure it's not surprising that the particular suburb that we lived in, the schools out here are largely white students, wealthy white students, and so we didn't want that. And so I mentioned before that my perspective on stories like this is to first think about what am I doing to contribute to the problem and what can I do to help the problem? And then I'm going to add this third thing now. What can I do to help my children be better, be more sympathetic, be more empathetic, be more able and more willing, and to not only embrace diversity, but to enact change, to insist on that kind of thing. And so that was just a baby step that we took at the beginning. It was just a decision that we made. And so, and as my children growing up, my youngest is 17 now, my oldest is 21. And we're happy with the bright, caring people that they've turned into. I think beyond that, talking about it is something that we can do. Taking opportunities to support measures, not just short stopgap measures either, but this is a systemic issue. I think if all the research shows nothing else other than the fact that this is a systemic issue, and it will take a systemic problem and systemic solution. And so systemic solutions often need to come from the ground up, from the grassroots up. And so by maintaining that kind of attitude, by maintaining that kind of approach, I think that we feel like we're taking steps in the right direction, but obviously it's just a drop in the bucket. And so I think vigilance, I think discipline, I think consistency, I think perseverance. I think all of those are going to contribute to things that I can do and that I can pass on to my kids, as far as at least taking the tiniest little chip out of this massive, problem that we have here in the United States.
Eli?
Yeah. So when I think about it, especially like in education, my son is biracial. His mom is Black. And I think about, because I don't know what perspective he's going to have about that, because I live in a rural town. It's not, I wouldn't say it's not, whitewashed, so to speak. I don't know if that's appropriate to say or not, but like there are non-white, there are people of color that live around here, but I don't think he has very many friends in school that are not white. And I'm curious about like what his perspective is going to be. And when I hear about things like, having school boards that don't represent the demographics accurately, and then having, not having access to this education about like Black history, well, that's my son's history too. It may not, necessarily, like I might not have as close of a relationship to it as he does, but that doesn't mean it's not important. And I wouldn't know the first place to start, to teach him that. So it does alarm me. And I'd prefer to see it change.
And Jonathan, I'm going to give you my last question before we wrap up. Even though I understand you're not a parent, but last time I checked, you're a human being. And as a human being,
Allegedly.
how do you see your role in advancing the cause?
I think that there's not, as part of the LGBTQ community, I can represent that. And in my personal relationships, of course, I'm in a very, very white community. There are one or two out of the some odd 50,000 people here who are of color that I've seen. And actually, both of them are my friends. But they don't see any representation here on any of the school boards or things like that. And when you consider that this is one of the centers for white nationalism, we have many, many terrorist groups in this state who have made national news. So the attitude here against people of color is devastatingly bad, but I speak up when I see it. If I'm out in public and I see somebody being a jerk, I will tell them they're a jerk. And people using bad language, I literally came close to jacking a guy up, which would have put me in jail, who was in my gym and using the N-word a lot. And I just started yelling at him. And I realized that was probably not the appropriate thing to do.
No,
but it made me feel better.
Ahead. Yeah, that was appropriate. I'm
it.
telling you right now.
What do I do?
Totally appropriate.
You just stand up for it.
Mm-hmm. One of the reasons why I wanted to go over this story, because even though it doesn't necessarily talk so much about secularism, atheism, or like some horrible pastor doing something horrible, like we said just another Wednesday, is because one of the things that is happening because of the rise of Christian nationalism is an attack on education. And the places that we're seeing it the most is the book bans. And book bans are coming very much so after stories that contain the LGBTQIA plus experience and the Black experience. And we're seeing more and more of these books that are coming off the shelves. And we're also seeing either a dumbing down or a complete erasure of African American studies curricula, in the public school areas all across the United States. And one of the things that I want to make our audience aware of, that even though that it may not necessarily be a secular issue, it is a humanist issue. And all of us should be very much so alarmed and aware of these things. And we also have to understand, and I'm just going to say it, that the United States would not be the United States if it was not for Black people. people. You remember that whole thing called slavery? Yeah. On that note, if you want to watch more nonprofits, click here.